Have you ever read amazing RPG stories people have discussed on the internet? Awesome tales, such as how a player's barbarian battled an emerald dragon as they both fell from the sky, how a tech priest held the line against chaos cultists so their ship could pull away safely, or even funny stories such as Sir Barrington. People play RPGs in the hope of one day they'll be able to tell such epic tales of their own, both to brag to their friends and remind themselves of the good time they had on that day or during the campaigns in general. But you want to know the one thing you rarely ever see in such stories? The fiddly mechanical details of the system. Outside the most die-hard character optimization boards, you don't hear anything like, oh, I gained a +4 from the Bless bonus, but then I did a trick that boosted my damage by 3d6. No, if anything, people are going to say how their barbarian were emboldened by the cleric's prayer in the battle's darkest moment, for summoning his might to smite the demon in front of him. But that doesn't mean the mechanics themselves have disappeared. They were always there. The machinery running behind the scenes as a set of rules for everyone in the game world to follow, allowing challenges to be made and resolved. They're vital for RPG games that are not freeform, and often only come to the surface in stories with clever little rule abuses or ugly set of rules that ruin someone's enjoyment, but allow you to laugh at someone else's misfortune. Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing something that many storytellers find to be the ugly part of game systems: the mechanics. Now, it's not that dramatic. We're going to be having an in-depth look at Exalted mechanics, break down each aspect of the system and how it relates to the odds of success or assigning overall difficulty, so you can give your players a proper challenge that is neither too hard nor too easy. This is valuable, as while Exalted 3rd Edition is not terribly complex, at least in my opinion, compared to some of the other RPGs that exist on the market, it does ask for some in-depth understanding of how the base system works before adding mountains upon mountains of rule exceptions and charms and other powers. Exalted 3rd Edition has many subsystems, but for this video we'll be focusing on three things. First, we'll discuss the basic dice pool system and the math behind it, and along with its various dice tricks. Afterwards, we'll be looking at two subsystems in Exalted 3rd Edition you'll be getting the most use out of: combat and social. I won't be getting overly mathematical on your asses, as I don't know a lot of math myself. However, I will show you special rule of thumb metrics you can use to roughly calculate odds, so you can judge how challenging each individual counter or challenge will be. Many people will often look at such mechanics as the enemy, not willing to put up with them for any length of time. But mechanics are not your enemy. They're simply a set of rules to model challenges for your players to overcome. There are some more complex than others, but I don't think the rules in Exalted 3rd Edition are too terrible. The base system is actually pretty simple once you understand it, and knowing is half the battle. The other half is killing them. In fact, you're probably going to be stunned by some of the in-depth explanations that go on in this video, but the mechanical breakdowns are discussing how a game works under its hood. If you want to go more in depth, you can look at such things as Dungeons & Dragons to figure out how math works per level, spell effects, saving throws, modifiers, and their various times, and much more. I feel once you understand the base level of mechanics of the system, you can begin custom tailoring encounters to your players, rather than picking things out of the book and praying to God that they work. For those looking for mechanical help running Exalted and other systems, sorry, you're not going to find it here. Future videos in this series might turn back to things that are a bit more general, but not this one. Part 1. The basic system. In order to discuss any other part of this video and how to balance anything in this game, we're going to have to understand the basic mathematical principles behind the game engine. I'm going to assume that you've at least read the rules for Exalted 3rd Edition, and you have some idea what I'm going to be talking about. The storytelling system works by rolling a number of 10-sided dice, usually the sum of an attribute and ability pairing. Any dice that shows a 7 or higher is a success, while a 10 is worth 2 successes. These successes are used to overcome challenges your storyteller sets in the game. That is the essence of the storyteller system. Not that hard once you learn it. But Sandact, I already know that. I also read the book. What point are you actually trying to make here? Because describing how the system works at its core function is one thing, but do you actually understand the math that goes on behind this? If not, then we're about to delve into an uncomfortable amount of detail. A 10-sided dice has a 1 out of 10 chance of showing any individual number, so this means that mathematically we have a 4 out of 10 chance of getting at least a single success. This holds true until we get to about 3 or 4 dice, which turns the averages into something akin to each dice counting as half a success. This may sound odd, but remember that 10s count as 2 successes, so this messes with the odds a little bit. So if you're with me so far, this means that if you have a pool of 7 dice, then your average is going to be 3.5 successes, whereas 10 dice means you'll average 5 successes. The lowest roll you'll have is 1 or 2 dice, but a single level 1 stunt, aka something you put with more description at beyond I hit him with my sword, adds +2 to your dice roll, putting you back into the game's mathematical averages once more. This may seem deceptively simple, but I'm here to tell you that it's exactly that simple. The dice to success ratio is something that holds to be universally true for this entire video, and it's how I rate how difficult things are going to be for my players. Now I know math majors are screaming at me at this point that this isn't the case, and you're probably right that these are not the exact values, but they're solid enough to be used as a metric, at least before you start rolling 30 dice, at which time the system math tends to break down. But rolling more than 30 dice is actually a very rare occurrence. Now how do we determine what difficulty a roll should be just by gauging it? There's a simple method for that too. How hard would it be for an in real life human to attempt the same action? In the Exalted scale, a difficulty 1 roll is something that would challenge an expert, but isn't something he hasn't seen before. While a difficulty 5 roll is something that even the most skilled people on the planet would find very difficult to pull off. Go ahead and use these difficulties for the same actions. But if you need a quick shorthand method of how to assign something, think of the simplest thing that action can be, but for every time you can use AND or increase the danger by a single step up, then that difficulty increases by 1. For example, picking a locked door when you have all the time in the world and the proper tools, difficulty 1. Picking a lock made by a master locksmith, difficulty 2. Quickly picking a master lock while you hear the footsteps of a guard around a corner, difficulty 3. Picking a sorcerously enchanted lock while the sounds of battle ring out around you, difficulty 4. Picking a master lock while the entire castle is being worn away by a sorcerer's hurricane while a battle rages on around you, difficulty 5. Now one thing to keep in mind about difficulties is to keep them consistent across the game and the player. Just because the lock in the beginning of the game is difficulty 1, don't make the same lock difficulty 3 later on just because the players have more power or another player attempts to try to open lock as well. Likewise, if a player has a high dice total in his attribute plus ability pool, then don't artificially bloat the difficulty of the roll just because they have a high value. Let the player feel like his investment in that was worth the cost. That means that, yes, any Exalt with a 10 in the dice pool and relevant charms is going to crush the difficulty you leave before them. This is intentional. But what's also important with this is that the difficulty scale allows people who are just dabbling in ability or who are unskilled to also take part as well. This is very important as a difficulty 5 roll is within the realm of plausibility for most people to achieve. If you're looking for other ways to add or increase the difficulty, use penalties, which I'll be discussing a bit more about later. Now, while we can, in theory, increase the difficulty all the way to 10, I'm here to tell you never do this unless there are exceptional circumstances. Esoteric lore regarding Third Circle Demon or High Essence God, such as how to appease them when virtually nothing is known about them, could be something of a difficulty 6 roll. If you think this is the case, put some difficulties on what a superhuman range of abilities can be, and use them sparingly. If you do it right, the players will feel like this is a true challenge of their skills that they've been preparing for all this time. But this means most of the time, players will more or less succeed on actions that they really want to. This is important for 2 reasons. First, is because Exalted is a high-powered game. It's usually less of a question if a player succeeds on a roll, and more about what kind of cost they'll pay in order to succeed. Those coming from lower power RPGs such as D&D or, God forbid, Warhammer might find this a bit odd, but I assure you it's true. Exalted is typically more concerned with weaving a narrative, and since that narrative is playing as a reincarnated God King, some challenges mortals find difficult are actually going to be really easy. But this doesn't mean that the players or the rest of the players are going to be perfect at everything. I mean, there are times the players can fail rolls. In my experience, this is a rarity when players actually try to pass a roll. Secondly, as I mentioned in the last video, Exaltation does not bestow wisdom or actions free of any kind of consequence. Now, if you want to make your rolls more difficult, but still stay within the 5 difficulty scale, you can instead apply penalties to these rolls. Difficulties themselves are how hard a challenge innately is because of itself. Penalties are often external factors that hinder your capability to complete it. Examples of external penalties are things such as the -2 penalty to awareness in order to locate somebody when you're blind, a -3 penalty social rules when attending a gala with dirty clothing, or a -5 penalty when trying to fly a ship through hurricane force winds, or whatever penalty modifier a poison coursing through your system has. People tend to forget penalties in the heat of the moment, but try to remember them if you can. They're not only there to make rules more difficult, but many charms also offset or get rid of penalties for actions, making players feel rewarded for purchasing the charms that nullify said penalties. Now lastly, we'll cover the so-called dice tricks of 3rd edition. I'll be using a post I found on Reddit for this. I don't know who made the math, but props to you, whoever you might be. Now, as I said, each die rolled has a 5 out of 10 chance to show a success, or 0.5 successes on average. If a power says that you double a number, for example double 9s, then the numerator, the top number, increases by 1, meaning a dodge charm, Dustmo's Whirling, each die now has a 6 out of 10 chance to show a success, or 0.6 successes on average. Now, re-rolling a die means you're actually removing its chances of appearing at all. So instead of the 5 out of 10, the denominator, the bottom number, decreases by 1, so we now have a 5 out of 9 chance of showing success, or 0.56 successes per roll. On average, this means getting 1 additional die per 10 dice rolled. An example of charm that does this is Excellent Strike. Adding all this up, you can get exact values if you really want to, which is a simple mathematical formula. But you shouldn't have to. In my opinion, continue using the default method of each die being half a success on average. If players have charms that let them do funky math, then let them feel rewarded for purchasing such a thing. Let enemies use them sparingly, not only to speed up the game, but also be a real threat to be felt when somebody actually capable of doing something appears, or in limited situations, such as when dogs get double 9 with smell rolls. Much later in the game, you can tailor the math of your antagonist's dice pools, along with charms, once you get used to the system. But I've been playing the years, and just using a half success per die metric works really well. Other ways to speed up the game could involve you physically altering the dice. If you have time to kill, then you can paint your d10 dice into colors to quickly count successes. Let 1s be black, 2 through 6 be red, 7 through 9 be green, and 10s gold. This doesn't account for things such as double 9s or reducing target numbers too easily, but it does help you more quickly count up your dice in most circumstances. There's also a dice program for smartphones called Onyx Dice, which lets you roll dice too. But in my opinion, the best dice bot is the one made for Discord by Strass. It not only instantly calculates the results of your dice rolls, but handles all rerolls for you. People might say that using such a thing, such as an electronic dice roll, detracts from the experience of a game. But for me, I'd rather have a computer calculate my result in a tenth of a second compared with the several needed by physical dice. This is especially noticeable when many dice tricks start appearing later on down the line. There's also several other online dice bots if you don't want to use Discord. I'll link them down in the video description below. And God help you if you're taking craft. In my opinion, if you're making artifacts, do those rolls after a session. They take up a lot of time with the amount of dice tricks involved. There's also an automatic dice roller I found online for it. It doesn't cover all the charms, but considering that you can knock off probably 70 successes on a good roll, I think this is more than enough to crush any kind of difficulty. So now that we have a grasp of how the basic mechanics work, let's jump right into the deep end and figure out how this actually applies to the two most important sections of Exalted: combat and social influence. Part 2. Combat Mechanics. Oh boy, we're getting into big boy stuff right now. This is often the part that makes or breaks storytellers for any edition of Exalted. With all the magical effects, I feel that some people tend to forget the base system underneath that powers all these fantasy magical effects. So in this video, I'll be discussing combat mechanics specifically. Encounter design and charm design will be things in other videos. As for this video specifically, I'll be discussing how the base system works. Once you get a grasp on these parts and fold them into a whole, I feel Exalted becomes a whole lot less more complicated. I'll try my best to break this down into sections that flow smoothly into one another, but there's a lot to cover here, and they kind of intertwine a lot, so please bear with me for this. And for those of you who probably know my reputation or heard rumors about it, I'm not going to go over combat as it relates to hyper-specialized combatants. I've done combat at nearly all levels, and I've found some tricks over the years that makes combat interesting for everyone over any level. Let's start with the most essential part of the combat system, the Withering Decisive Split. Exalted 3rd Edition combat is represented by gaining advantage over your opponent before making a single hit that will either end the combat or really mess up your opponent. To represent this, withering attacks are made against your opponent to reduce his initiative, which represents lowering the opponent's overall advantage in combat. Then once you have enough of an advantage, you can then make a finisher attack to KO your opponent. This may be a bit difficult to wrap your head around, but let's take an example from popular media. Star Wars, Luke vs. Vader in Episode 5. Luke was parrying and dodging every single one of Darth Vader's hits, but he was very clearly losing the battle. Darth Vader beat Luke in the corner before making a single attack that cut off Luke's hand, and essentially won the battle. Luke survived the hit, but he was in no condition to face off against Vader in his current state. The Exalted 3rd Edition combat engine is designed to replicate this. So let's go over the details of each aspect of combat, piece by piece. We're going to break these parts down around their central balance points in order to get a grasp of how better to balance things as part of a whole. There's a lot of important information to cover here, so we'll be going in order of how an attack is processed. So the first step in attack, comparing attack versus defense. Attacks are basically the same thing as a standard skill challenge. To hit someone, all you need to do is beat a difficulty that's equal to an opponent's defense. That's it. Withering attacks apply a weapon's listed accuracy to a roll. Decisive attacks do not. The reason for this is because the system literally relies on making successful withering attacks in order to build up resources for your decisive attack, for both players and antagonists. But since you do not get an accuracy bonus for decisive attacks, this means that while building initiative is easy, actually finishing the fight is a bit harder. Meaning most of the times, the defender will have a little advantage, where the opposite is true for withering attacks. This is because withering attacks are not inherently lethal to a character. Barring certain charms, they cannot cause long-term damage to you compared to decisive attacks, which can. The too long didn't read summary is this. You're expected to land withering attacks, which are not inherently lethal, in order to build up initiative for a decisive attack to smash the enemy clear out of a fight with an attack that's a little bit harder to land. The entire reason I say this is the second most important aspect of the fight is because a battle feels more engaging when there's a back and forth between two parties, and this will never happen if you keep missing attacks. This was the case back in Exalted 1st and 2nd Edition, which my actual advice for those systems is to use literally anything else other than Exalted 1st or 2nd Edition. If you like those games, good for you, but oh boy, do they ever have their warts. This also makes accuracy one of the two areas that needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully in order to simulate a back and forth combat, which I'll be discussing a bit later on in Party Parody. Now the next part of combat, damaging an opponent. Attacking an opponent with Withering or Decisive is largely handled the same, but there's a big difference between Withering and Decisive damage types and how they're treated. I'm going to be breaking down the combat balance aspects around these two damage types, but for now we'll be focusing on Withering attacks, as they're the egg for the chicken itself. We need to make them in order to build initiative to power our decisive attacks, so they'll actually hurt the opponent. There are some ways around this, but generally this is the way things are in this game. So what are the aspects of a Withering attack? The quick answer is raw damage and soak. Raw damage is the sum of a character's strength, the weapon's damage value, and any threshold successes you rolled over the opponent's defense. This is compared to the opponent's armor, which is then subtracted from the raw damage. What we have left over is the post-soak dice pool that are rolled to see if any damage is taken. Those are the moving parts in place for Withering Attack. I make it sound a bit complicated, but if you know what you're doing, this isn't that hard to calculate. Calculate base damage, that is, a person's strength plus weapon damage, ahead of time, so only the threshold successes actually need to be calculated, and after that, it's just subtracting soak. This isn't so hard, but I'll ask this question. Do you know what these values mean in context? If you look at armor values compared to soak, you'll notice weapon damage is pretty inflated compared to normal soak. The reason for this is what I said earlier. You're expected to damage people on Withering Attack rolls. The main thing armor does is help it make so the hit doesn't hurt as much, rather than completely stop it without any kind of complete reliability. This is because soak is the interesting part of the equation. In fact, I find it to be one of the most polarizing things in combat. Too little and people are torn to shreds. Too much and battle slows down to complete slog if the opposite side doesn't have proper damage adding charms. It's pretty easy to get some sky high soaks, but how much is too much? In my own opinion, the sweet spot for this is wanting a player to get at least 4 to 6 dice of damage post-soak. That is, the raw damage minus the total soak value. This provides a quick back and forth combat feeling without taking too much or too little damage. Notice I gave the damage value instead of a soak value. That's because as a storyteller, you're going to need to figure out some ways to increase that damage, either by charms or raw numbers. This is often the second trickiest part to balance for a combat, only charms actually beating it. We'll discuss this in group parity in a little bit, so if your brain is trying to figure out how to balance such things, put that on the back burner for now. And by the way, this post-soak value is before you start adding charms and other effects added on top of that. This is because if you can get that amount of dice, I feel, combat usually flows a lot quicker because charms tend to add quite a bit more damage, even for Dragon-Blooded. It's worth noting, however, that Withering Attacks in this case can never actually KO opponents who also have an initiative track. In theory, you can slap someone down to negative 25 initiative, but no matter how many Withering hits a person takes, they'll still be in the game. Exalted 3E has a warning not to game the system like this, meaning don't drag the combat out deliberately just to milk an overkill amount of initiative. Only try to get as much as you can to think you can knock out the opponent in one hit, rather than try to get something stupid like over 100 initiative. So how much do we actually need to take down an opponent in this case? Let's discuss the other type of damage roll, decisive attacks. Decisive attacks are very easy to calculate. Their damage is your initiative flat. That's it. Barring magic, no threshold successes are added. Nothing we need to subtract or add to the raw total, just your initiative. That means that yes, a single kick is resolved mechanically just the same as a broadsword when it comes to making a decisive attack. If this confuses you in game terms, remember back to the Withering Decisive Split and what it means. Getting hit by a decisive attack means that you are actually hit. A stabbing attempt with a Withering attack could be represented by how you stepped out of the way at the last moment, or how your armor stopped the blade dead. But a successful decisive attack means that the blade hit home somewhere in your body. Maybe it could only be a flesh wound in the shoulder, or maybe it struck home and hit you in the heart, and now you need to make a new character sheet. In this sense, it means you've commanded enough of a narrative lead in combat in order to land that blow that will knock your opponent out or cleave them in two. Some people I know don't like this narrative dissonance, but after going through the pain of Exalted 2nd Edition for so long, I welcome this dissonance with open arms because it's a functional system. Now, knocking your opponent out requires you risking all of your hard-earned initiative to even attempt to make the killing blow. The damage on it rolled being the damage to the opponent's health levels, their actual meat points. I only need to know how much initiative I actually need to kill my opponent. Just tell me that already. I'm getting there! The average human, and thus nearly all Exalted, have 7 health levels at base. Using no damage boosting magic, it takes an average of 17 to 19 dice to reliably one-hit KO an opponent with 7 health levels. The math on decisive attacks are a bit less, as each dice is worth only 4 out of 10 to show a success, meaning each die on a decisive attack is worth 0.4 successes. This is a pretty useful metric for figuring out how long a combat is going to take. Just add up all the health levels of the opponent, then divide by 0.4. That's how much initiative you're probably going to need in order to get the victory in this battle. This is a very rough guess, as charms can probably alter these numbers quite a bit, but I find it's the quickest and most useful method. For example, someone with 10 health levels would need about 25 initiative to KO in one hit. Someone with 13 health levels would need 33 initiative to KO in one hit, etc, etc. Now, finally, we have some numbers that will let us understand the system at its core. But that leads to the next biggest question people will have. How do I balance a combat scene for my players? I think a better question to ask is, how do I balance a combat scene for all of my players? This is what I mean by player parity. See, in some other level-based systems, such as Dungeons & Dragons, we have things such as levels. This concept of levels gives us a rough idea of how competent a character should be in the game world. That he can take a hit from an enemy around the same level without completely dying, and contribute to the group as best as he can. Exalted, however, has no such mechanic in place, meaning it's entirely possible to get one player who can slice and dice enemies, but another player who can only ineffectually paw an opponent, or one player having such high soak values that anything that could actually damage them will flat out cripple any other player. These are very real problems that many storytellers struggle with. I want to go over how to overcome such things in depth in another video regarding encounter design, but I'm going to cover the basics for now. So to unpack this problem, you'll find out it has three aspects. First is hitting the opponent. Second is damaging them. Third is defending yourself. For calculating to hit ratios and keeping everyone roughly in the same space, there's one quick rule I use for that. How does everyone's base dice pool relate to the challenge at hand? I mentioned how to do this in my Storyteller's Guide under Antagonists, but I'm going to mention it here as well. A difference of 4 more dice between characters means a character with lesser dice is going to have a much harder time keeping up with a person with higher dice pools. Often, they'll need to use magic just to barely keep up with the other one with a higher dice pool. That can still put up a fight without using any magic. What you want to aim for is making sure each player has a base accuracy pool of at least no more than 3 dice between each player, with base accuracy being the attribute plus ability combo used to hit before adding any other accuracy bonuses. This makes it so while there is still an advantage held by a player with higher dice pools, the value isn't completely insurmountable to the person with lower dice pools. But perhaps you want some examples so I'm not just pulling things straight out of my ass. Let's assume the some attack rolls with the absolute maximum a player can have with 11 dice, one a bit less at 9 dice, then the last one at 7 dice. The 11 dice character, the chances of hitting someone with a defense of 5 is at least 66%, while hitting 6 defense is at least 50%. A character with 9 dice has a roughly 50% chance to hit someone with 5 dice, and a 30% chance to hit someone at 6 defense. See how quickly these odds are beginning to shift with only a 2 die difference? A character with 7 dice attempting to hit a character with 5 defense is going to only roughly have a 25% chance of actually hitting the opponent, while bringing defense of 6 is going to be roughly 13%. An interesting challenge for the 11 dice character is going to be very difficult for the 7 dice character to overcome, and the 7 dice character is going to have to spend resources just to even keep up with this. But Sand Act, weapon accuracy helps offset those odds. A character with less base attack can grab a higher accuracy weapon, while those with higher accuracies can stick with heavier and less accurate weapons. In the end, everything is balanced. If I had a nickel for every single time this was said. For withering attacks, this is largely true. But remember how I said decisive attacks don't use accuracy at all? This can be circumvented by players who know the system very well, combined with clever charm use, but most of the time this isn't the case. If anything, the player with higher dice pools can use base charms even better. Keep in mind, this is also before accuracy bonuses are factored in. Accuracy does indeed help for a little while, but when it's come time to make a decisive attack, things become really ugly real fast when you default to your base values. Again, you can overcome this by spending resources, but as I said, you're going to be spending resources in order just to keep up on par with the guy who has the higher dice pools, which he'll also be able to put to better use since he'll likely have a better maximum dice cap in case he wants to go all out. This is why I stress it's important for new storytellers to keep their players roughly the same dice pool in specific areas, mainly in combat. If you want to shorten it, you can use weapon accuracy to help bridge that gap. It just gives some players some hints they are probably going to need to use some heavy magic when it comes time to use decisive attacks. But things are certainly easier if the base dice pools before accuracy bonuses are roughly the same. The same thing can happen with soak too. What one player finds easy to punch through, another player could find extremely difficult. As I mentioned before, the ideal is having 4 to 6 dice post soak. But while defense can be lowered, soak cannot. I'll be discussing how to overcome these problems in a future video regarding encounter design, but I can share a few tricks immediately. One is to have the opponent get soaked by a charm or some other method of resources so you can accurately fine-tune how much soak a character has. Another method is having burner initiative charms that can generate fake initiative that can only be used for absorbing withering attacks. This lets the big beefy brawlers do the damage they want, while those with lesser dice pools can still gain initiative to keep up with everyone else and make a decisive attack later on. Certain attack abilities, mainly Brawl, also have the ability to put out fairly hefty spikes of damage in relatively short order. Some builds in particular are really good at using decisive attacks at the beginning of a battle in order to try to KO or at least cripple an opponent into worthlessness. These are what I call Alpha Strike builds. That is, they attempt to kill the opponent on the very first tick of combat or very soon into combat. Throne is very, very good at this. Single Shining Point in the Void, a martial arts charm, has some of the highest burst damage in the game, only being rivaled by Solar Melee after spending a considerable amount of XP into it. A lot of people consider Single Point very broken, but I kinda consider Righteous Devil to be just on par with this bullshittery. Alright, that's quite a bit off our shoulders now, ain't it? What I told you was the extended version of the basic system. And with this knowledge, you should be able to have a better grasp on how to gauge a combat just by looking at opponents. Things do change dramatically once charms are introduced, but if I do this here in this video, it will swell up to Titanic lengths, as the counter design is best handled in his own video. Believe me, I tried to make the notes of this video, and I can quickly see how deep that rabbit hole went and where it tried to lead me. Just know for now, the beginning area of the game, roughly 0 to 50 XP, you can eyeball the numbers and get fairly decent combat encounters. But what are the other major aspects of Exalted Third Edition? The social system. Hang on to your butts, we're about to slingshot into an entirely different beast. Part 3. Social Mechanics. Thankfully, the social system is a bit easier to explain, unlike the crunchy main combat system. Social tends to rely a bit more on a narrative structure. Rather than go, yeah, you roll over some number, he's convinced, Exalted system has far more nuance. In order to make a successful social influence check against your opponents, you're going to need to go a bit more in depth, learning about what makes them tick before finally moving in to ask for big favors. Barring magic, Exalted's social system, in my opinion, is one that favors the long haul a bit more in general. But there are multiple ways in which we can use it and shortcut it. For now, I'm going to give you a basic overview of the system and the options within it. The math for social influence is pretty simple affair actually. There are dice tricks and such, whose math I discussed in part 1 of this video, but it has far less steps. Decide what social action you want to take, both sides decide what intimacies they're using for the attack and defense, declare charms, then roll the resolve. That's it. Very simple in comparison to combat. I'm going to discuss the major aspects of the social system right now, and try my best to explain them, but they're all heavily interconnected, so try to bear with me on this. Resolve is often the first step of social influence, representing the mental fortitude and stubbornness of the character that you need to beat in order to affect them with any kind of social influence. Resolve is interesting, as unlike defenses in combat, is actually capable of fluctuating quite rapidly. It can increase dramatically when you use intimacies for defense, or it could go down just as much if they're used against you. An important side note of Resolve is that it's also like defense used against mental attacks in the setting. Meaning if you go up against Raksha, then don't be surprised that they have a charm that allows you to attack based on your resolve instead of your defense. Guile is the defense stat that represents your poker face, how hard or easy it is for others to read you and what you hold close to your heart. Characters with low Guile essentially wear their heart on their sleeves, while those with high Guile keep others guessing what they're really after. Guile is important, as people need to beat your Guile score in order to learn any of your intimacies, which are incredibly important, which I'll detail why shortly. But one of the most effective ways of going about defending yourself against social influence is making sure your opponents never get a chance to take any of your relevant intimacies, ever. Guile doesn't go up or down like Resolve does, making it a little bit more dependable when you're trying to keep your secrets. Intimacies are the core aspect of social influence in Exalted Third Edition. They're the principles your character lives by, or the people, places, and things that they're willing to stake their lives for. It's important to note that in order for many social influence checks to actually function, or go through at all, they must target a relevant intimacy in some way. I repeat, they must target an intimacy or not work at all. in most cases. Strengthening or weakening an intimacy involves you targeting an intimacy that's at least one step lower than the intimacy you wish to raise or lower. Or persuasion involves targeting a relevant intimacy first for the task and the lengths of the task someone will go through with you. Bargain and threaten have their own methods for resolution that don't use intimacies, but in my experience, instilling new intimacies and persuasions are the options most used by players. What I mean by social influence being the long game is the rule of escalation in regards to intimacies. Instilling intimacies in someone is often one of the best ways to get someone to do what you want. While applying an initial intimacy may be very easy, getting anything after that will be harder, as you're required to target higher and higher level intimacies in order to increase the steps up along the way. Minor, major, and defining. But there's a shortcut. If someone knows the defining level intimacy on their opponent, and if you can figure out how to make your persuade action support a specific course of action that aligns with the defining intimacy, you can make your opponent do almost anything you want without magic. An opponent can resist with a decision point, but if you keep assaulting their defining intimacies, then sooner or later they relent because they run out of intimacies in order which to defend themselves with. In-game, this can be represented as a lengthy debate, and people with social eyes can figure out these intimacies much sooner than anyone else. This is the real power of social influence at work. Even without any sort of magic, you can quite possibly convince someone to do something for you that can potentially put them in a great deal of harm or risk. Threaten is an interesting action, as quite often it bypasses most actual intimacies and goes directly towards your own perceived power. This method may not make you many friends, but it will certainly get you what you want if you appear tough enough. Just keep in mind that if you do threaten someone's life, you're going to need able to appear that you're both able and willing to do the part. Resisting a threatened action is a bit more narrative approach, with a selected target looking at their intimacy list to decide if there's any valid intimacy that can allow them to resist. If there's a match, then that they resist, then trying to intimidate the target requires an upscaling of the harm involved. So instead of you trying to kill the guard, or threatening to kill a guard that blocks your way, say that you'll let him live, after you kill his family in front of him. This can be done in a more subtle and less blunt method, such as claiming to be a merchant and knowing the guard. If your story sounds plausible, then you can do a simple threaten action by saying, okay, let's see how our boss is going to say about refusing me. You can add more to this if you somehow know some personal secrets of the guard's boss, Vera, as well too. Bargain actions are largely the same as threaten actions, only instead of using some harm as a vector, you're using some goods or services in exchange, something of value that the other party wants. If it fails, then you have to considerably up this kind of ante. The only difference is that bargaining actions usually don't leave a negative intimacy or impression on someone, so if you have a high resources value or some other valuable skills, this can really be put to work to you. A craft character can quite possibly offer a wide variety of things as part of his bargain, or someone with high resources can often just have some silver pieces to soothe people over. But keep services in mind too. If you have a reputation as a famous investigator, then someone can agree to do you a favor if you uncover something for them. An assassin can gain favor with someone by offering his services to kill a rival. A famous courtesan could offer a free night in exchange for a little favors as well. Inspire is special as it puts a temporary emotion on the target. When a target is overcome with an emotion, they are counted as having that emotion as a major intimacy. This is actually a very useful thing to do, as one can induce some blues in someone in order to more easily lower an intimacy, or spread anger around a room in order to more easily convince others to rise up and oppose their slave master. What's even more useful about this is it doesn't require intimacy to target any resource, or negative intimacies being placed on your target. It doesn't directly do anything, but makes your rolls a hell of a lot more easy. For people who have little to no social eyes, this might be a good idea to slap your target with Inspire action, and target them when they're feeling down in the dumps. Instilling an intimacy puts a brand new intimacy on a target or strengthens a currently existing intimacy. This intimacy can be anything that you want, but it might help to understand the opponent before slapping an intimacy on them. For example, if you want to instill an intimacy regarding the love of war onto a hardcore pacifist, that may be a really hard thing to do, considering most of that pacifist intimacies most likely reject any kind of war-loving attitude. Meanwhile, an ambitious prince, however, could very well like that mindset towards war, allowing him to conquer his enemies more easily. or push them into directions that you want to put them into. This can be very effective when setting up persuade actions down the line, but you have to keep in mind that you have to target intimacies, other intimacies, in order to strengthen the current intimacy you want to strengthen. Yeah, it sounds a bit odd, but just keep in mind that it takes a bit of work. Usually it might be better just to use the read intention actions, then immediately try to use persuade action on some kind of defining intimacy in order to make them take a course of action that you want to take. Persuasion is the action when you want somebody to do something for you. That's really it. But in order to get people, demons, or otherworldly, horrific monsters to do things for you, you first need to target their intimacies. As I said before, people only do things for you so long as you can relate an intimacy to them, barring magic. If they have a defining intimacy towards you, then you can get them to do basically anything you want. Most of the time, people do not, so you're going to need to be a bit more creative in regards to how you can do this, somehow bending the arms of their intimacies in order to get them to do as you want. If soldiers have a love of their homeland, then you can pass off the old "if you won't fight for me, then fight for your homeland" speech. Or an accountant with the intimacy of dislike towards his coworkers could be convinced to smuggle out some purchasing records for you, so you can better able to track whatever you want around the scavenger lands, such as that lovely artifact you want to find. Now, if a social influence check goes past the resolve, you still have one extremely powerful option left: spending willpower to resist. You cannot do this against all checks, but you can do it against most. You can stop new intimacies from being formed, or prevent a major or defining intimacy from being weakened. Note that this specifically does not stop an intimacy from increasing intensity. Whenever this is a deliberate action on part of 3rd edition's part, or an oversight, I have no idea. But what this does mean is that once you have your foot in the door, it becomes much easier to increase the intensity of intimacies. Resisting a persuasion attempt, however, requires entering a decision point, where you need to select some other intimacy of greater or equal intensity to justify why you cannot do the action what you're being asked. This is a powerful defense, to the point where characters with a low resolve could easily just let persuasion attempts bypass the resolve and just enter a decision point to knock off the intimacy. In order to get around this, one will need to rephrase their argument by finding some other intimacy to play off of. The opponent will eventually run out, as the same intimacy cannot be used twice for a decision point. Alternatively, you can force a reset by changing the intensity of the intimacy the opponent used to resist at the decision point. If you can't do that, then it doesn't really matter if they roll infinite successes on a persuasion attempt. They'll either need to force the persuasion retry condition listed in the book, or face stomach you off because you couldn't do a better argument other than "pretty please" with sugar on top. Penalties also exist in social influence as well, including, but not limited to, taking place for the believability of your claims to your current appearance. Lying can certainly be a quick way to get people to do what you want, but you need to make your lies believable. Example could be showing up to a party with last season's fashion, or in a military uniform of a kingdom that recently lost a major battle. And the little things that don't seem overly important can really mean a big deal in social combat. Major things could be things such as wearing a t-shirt saying "fuck nice things" to a fancy gala, or wearing an elegant dress in a back alley gang meeting. This could also represent getting people to trust you when they might have heard a reputation for you being dishonest. A -5 penalty is a big deal and only reserved for the most extreme circumstances, such as getting the help from a person whom is actively hostile towards you, wearing tattered clothing to a formal gala, or massive lies such as Dungeons & Dragons 3.5e being the greatest RPG to ever exist. These penalties are often overlooked, so before signing a roll, try to take a second and think of any relevant factors in the area that could contribute to a penalty to a roll. As I said, there are many charms that eliminate penalties, so when players actually get these charms, they'll feel rewarded when actually using them. In fact, one good way to force penalties on an opponent is to ambush them just before a social meeting, but don't actually bother trying to harm them. In fact, aim to damage their clothing just a little bit with some kind of minor damage, so their appearance will be, let's say, not in the best of pristine state. So these kind of galas are often ruthless for perfectionism, so you'll want to do your best to stand out or face a very, very hefty upward climb and being embarrassed by every one of your social rivals and peers. But please keep one thing in mind about social influence above all else. It's meant to enhance your game, not bog it down. If your dashing socialite wants to go to a fancy gala and hasn't done anything to anger the local leader, just let them inside with a single persuasion roll against the guards. This is because the majority of the interesting material for the socialite is in the party, in the gala itself. If you're forcing a giant social debate to happen just on the guards alone, then it's going to tax the resources of the socialite, who would probably rather spend it on the VIPs inside the party. Having an entire debate with the guards, you're just bogging down the game on a scene that isn't meant to be the focal point of the session. Can it be interesting? Absolutely, but in most cases, it's not the highlight of a session, and the significance of the guards pale in comparison to whomever is likely inside. Now, one of the greatest problems I've heard people having with the social system is robbing characters of their agency. Some people are really particular about this, or even take offense at NPCs doing something as a persuasion action against them, to the point where they're often a hair away from going, "Fuck you, you do not tell me how to play my character." Some of them may choose to abstain or ignore social altogether. There are two rebuttals to this. One of them is the same point I just raised a minute ago. Social influence should enhance the game's experience, not get in its way. Rather than being pissed off for going along with someone's whim, think about how it can enhance the story. One idea I heard from the storyteller side is to reward someone with Splat XP for a role-playing bonus for willingly going along with an NPC social action if it improves the story. In fact, if that's how you gain social experience, by developing your character organically through the story as it unfolds at the table. Second, is that this is incredibly antisocial. If you're ignoring social combat, then you're effectively plugging ears going, "La la la la, I cannot hear you," over and over again. If such a person did this in real life, then they're not overly fun to interact with. Social is a bit of a back and forth in this regard. Take actions what you feel not only makes sense for your character, but also makes the best feel for the story and the most enjoyment for the game overall. But I don't disagree with these people entirely. Shuffling around someone's intimacy list too much may suddenly result in a character that the player is no longer interested in you playing. In this case, I recommend the player and the storyteller work together in order to hash such a thing out, maybe by saying during significant downtime and intense inner reflection, the character reshuffles their intimacies into something that represents their character once more. Having a high resolve in Guile helps, but the best advice I'd have is to grab some integrity charms in this case, especially the charm Righteous Lion Stance. This charm makes it so that going against said protected intimacy is an invalid command. That is on par with someone telling them to kill themselves. An invalid command needs no willpower to resist, so it's very useful. Something so extreme that most people won't even consider it, and if they do, you might want to start seeking help for depression. This charm can protect the very core of what your character holds dear, and virtually every single Exalted in the game has some sort of variation of this charm, even Dragonblooded. From the storyteller side of things, I'd only say use such charms sparingly, such as Dragonblooded, who had his fiancée killed by anathema during a wild hunt before his eyes, and will stop at nothing to see his crusade to wipe every single one of them off of creation get in his way. And that just about wraps up this video. It might have taken a bit of time, but by explaining both the math and the significance behind actions, I feel one is better able to take the whole of the material in order to better use it. If the social and combat breakdowns seem too much, I put some links to the cheat sheet flowcharts down in the description below. It seems like a lot, but I feel that once you get used to it, there's really not much to it. This is why I often tell people new to the system, do some basic things in order to get used to the flow of the system and how it works. Given that this is Exalted, a lot of people might try to learn how to run before they can walk, but be sure to remember the fundamentals as you continue running or playing the game. Next time we're going to zoom a little bit more in depth. We've already discussed the basics of scene construction in the last videos, so in the next video we'll be discussing combat encounter design. I'll go over some advice on what makes a combat encounter good versus one that's merely white room rolling numbers, which is now easier explained now that we have advanced mechanics out of the way. Until next time, take care.